Can you tell what someone is on based on the size of their pupils? And can this be used to predict if somebody is going to relapse or not? So, as a drug scientist that is also addicted to reality TV, this thing is commonly brought up all the time. So, people will say, like, oh yeah, Amber is definitely back on drugs. Have you looked at the size of her pupils? People are actually developing new smartphone apps that supposedly will do that exact thing. Look at your pupils and determine if you're on a specific drug. Like, just how accurate is this test? Like, can we replace the breathalyzer with this? So we've been looking at how drugs affect pupil size since like the 1920s in a variety of different animals. And it's actually kind of interesting because pupil size is controlled by two different things. So like one aspect of pupil size is controlled by the sphincter muscle, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, while the other type of muscle, the dilator muscle, is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic, remember, is like rest or digest, and the sympathetic is the fight, flight, or freeze. So like this is a valid test to see how drugs are interacting with your nervous system. Is it causing more of the rest or digest effects, or is it causing more of the fight and flight? So there are like common drugs that actually cause your pupils to either constrict or become smaller, or dilate or become larger. So in terms of the drugs that cause constriction, the most common one is just opioids. So primarily things that work on the mu opioid system. So those are your common opioids like H and Phen and Oxy. And so this is the most common one that you see in like reality TV. They'll say like definitely has relapsed to opioids. Look at how small those pupils are. And this is actually pretty reliable. So we do see that opioids reliably constrict your pupils. And we also see that this is related to how the drug is actually working. So we can kind of do like time course and like actually look at how much of the drug is metabolized by looking at people's pupils. Now, in terms of dilation, you get so many different drugs. So you have all the phenethylamines. So those are things like speed, as well as decongestants and some versions of antidepressants, and things like Molly. And then you also see dilation for things like every hallucinogen out there and blow. But then you have other drugs that might not cause any consistent effects. So like we see basically nothing for Ket. And some people say that weed actually makes your pupils constrict, and then other studies say that they make them dilate. And then you have the research that says that it causes changes for long after the impairment is over. And then alcohol is that same problem. Like there are studies that say that it goes in opposite directions. And then there's studies that say like glassy eye matters more, or maybe what it does depends on your heart rate variabilities. Yeah, that does not bode well for how well this will work to test if somebody's on alcohol. And we have a good way to measure that anyways, a breathalyzer. So even though it seems like some drugs may produce consistent effects, there are a lot of problems with this. So for example, one thing is that not everyone's pupils are made exactly the same size. You kind of have to look at the effects in comparison to their normal pupil size, but you just don't have that information offhand. People can get around this in a kind of weird way. So we know that, for example, opioids might constrict the pupils. And so if you give a drug that counteracts that, it should then make the pupils become larger. Now, if you give somebody like naloxone and they're not on opioids, it should not actually do anything to their pupil size. But if they are on opioids, it should restrict that constriction, if you want to think of it that way. So needing a baseline is only like one of the potential problems that exists with this idea that you can look at pupils and determine which drug somebody's on. There's also problems that like certain drugs only produce effects for certain periods of time. So benzos, for example, will only produce pupil changes for like the first hour or so. And some drugs might not actually cause pupil changes at all, but cause things like nystagmus changes. So I always show this video of nystagmus. It's just my adorable cat, where her eyes are moving back and forth. Some drugs only cause that instead of changing the pupil size. And some drugs do things like cause your eyes to be red. So it's not necessarily that it's a pupil change, but your eyes just look different. And then there are all the other things that cause somebody's pupils to change in size. So for example, if you're in bright light, that can change the size of your pupils. If you are trying to like focus on something, that can change the size of your pupils. Age can cause changes. And remember how I said that the sympathetic nervous system is actually playing a role in the size of your pupils? Yeah, if you like increase activation of that, so if you like stress yourself out, if you are like sexually aroused, if you have any sort of like emotional arousal, that can all change the size of your pupils too. Because what we see is that things like dopamine can actually dilate the pupils. And so if you're on a drug that increases dopamine, that can cause dilation of pupils. But also, dopamine is increased like all the time, so it might not actually be measuring anything consistently. Now, side note, that's why they say that like your pupil size can actually show if you are attracted to somebody or not. It's not necessarily measuring attraction, it's just measuring things like emotional arousal. Like it also dilates for things like pain. You can't really tell if somebody's pupil is dilating because they're attracted to you or because you cause them pain. If you wanted to use pupil size as like a good measurement of drug use, you would actually have to do quite a few things. So first, you would have to make sure everybody has like the same lighting in the scenario that you're using this in, which very difficult. Two, you would have to make sure that there's like a good camera where you can actually measure like small changes in pupil size. Three, you would want a baseline measurement if possible. Four, you'd want to look at other things other than just pupil size. So like, are their eyes moving back and forth? Then finally, you need the good programming to pull it all together to say, hey, this drug typically does this under these conditions. So there are a lot of drugs that people take that might interfere with this measurement that you don't necessarily care about. So like antihistamines cause changes in pupil size, for example. I've mentioned that some antidepressants do, and nasal decongestions. Caffeine dilates your pupils, and a lot of people are taking a lot of caffeine. So in terms of detection, this might not be the best idea, but it is opening up these kind of weird new areas for things that looking at pupil sizes might be able to do in the future. For example, they've been using it to look at L-DOPA, which is a common medication used for Parkinson's. So they're seeing like, can a pupil size be used to determine what dosage somebody should be taking of L-DOPA? And it seems like it can be. How much your pupil size changes on things like antipsychotics can actually be used to predict whether or not somebody's going to kind of have a relapse or have another episode of schizophrenia after they have been taken off those antipsychotics. And it might be a valid way to determine if somebody's more likely to relapse to things like alcohol. So there was a study that had people look at like pictures of alcohol-related stimuli, so like beer or a shot glass. And what they found was that just looking at that caused people's pupils to dilate. And it would actually dilate more in people who are more likely to relapse in the future. So should we use it as a way to detect if somebody's on a drug? Well, it's probably not more reliable than the other methods that we have, and it's not really a quick and fast way because there are so many different variables that go into this. But like detection is actually like the least cool of the ways that we can use this information in the future.